Greetings, everyone. My name is Emily Louie, and on behalf of Campbell and Company, I would like to welcome you to What's Next? Building a Vision to Engage, Rally, and Inspire. Thanks so much for joining us today. Before we begin today's presentation, I'd like to quickly go through some logistics for those of you who may be new to our webinars. First, please close any programs other than the GoToWebinar that are running on your computer. Next, we recommend calling in with a telephone instead of using your computer speakers. And if you experience any visual issues, please send a chat to Campbell and Company or contact GoToWebinar at the number on your screen. Today's webinar will last 60 minutes and you'll earn one continuing education credit that is good with your participation with CFRE International. Within the next 24 hours, you'll receive an email from GoToWebinar that includes information on how to download your certificate. In that same follow-up email, you'll also receive a link to download today's slides along with a link to the recording. We do welcome questions throughout the webinar, so please use the questions box in the GoToWebinar control panel that should be on the right side of your computer screen. We'll also be holding time at the end of the webinar for a Q&A. And with that, I'd like to turn it over to our presenters today, Communications Consultant Sarah Babb and Communications Senior Consultant Patrick Chestnut.
Hi, everybody. It's great to be with you today. Pat and I are excited to talk visioning. I'm obviously Sarah. I've been with the firm for 3 years. I'm originally part of the Northwest team, but recently moved back to the Midwest, which is where I'm from. So I'm now part of the Chicago team. Pat, want to introduce yourself?
Hey, everyone. Sure thing. My name's Pat Chestnut. I'm a senior communications consultant. Been with Campbell Company for about 10 years. I'm based out of Chicago, but I've had the opportunity to work with a wide variety of nonprofits in all sectors and all missions all across the country. And along with Sarah, I help co-lead our visioning work. So really glad to be here and to talk visioning, which is one of our favorite topics.
Truly. All right, so before we get started, we want to just lay out an agenda so you know what's coming your way. It should be a pretty simple agenda. We want this to be as much presentation as it is discussion. So we're going to start with a brief outline of why you need a vision and what it is. We're going to talk visioning principles, things that set a vision apart from other things and set visioning apart in the nonprofit sector. And then we're going to hit on what makes a vision work, kind of some of those tactical aspects of really writing a vision statement before moving into what makes visioning work. What kind of process do you need to actually get to that statement that we've talked about? As we ramp into those, we'd like to go ahead and invite you to put questions in the box as they occur to you. Pat and I want to see those questions. We're hoping to kind of hit them as we go. So if during these first 2 sections you want to drop things in, we'll definitely be tracking them and work them in and have an opportunity for more of our discussion a little later. So with that, I think we'll get started. You good, Pat? You want to add anything before we roll? All right.
Nope, good.
So we're going to, thanks. All right, so we're going to start just with why you need a vision and what sets it apart. And I think, there are questions that we in the nonprofit sector hear all the time that kind of, might strike some fear sometimes, some frustration. We're just used to hearing them. So that starts with, from donors. These new plans sound great. What do they add up to? This sounds like what you're already doing, just more of it. What will be different afterward? What are you really doing here? I'm a fan of the new leaders so far, but where are they taking the organization? What's next? And finally, I think in this moment, we're hearing the pandemic and uprising have changed everything. What are you doing differently? Where are you going now? How is this moment affecting the way that you do your work? These are questions they're big questions. They're foundational questions. And when you hear them, sometimes the answer isn't simple. And a vision is, about working through those questions, having a straightforward answer, and being ready to respond to them. The need for a vision becomes clear at different key pivot points, right? So all of these questions represent represent moments of transition, moments of change for an organization. We're calling out kind of 4 of them right here. Leadership transition, the shift from one leader to another, one leader wanting to take an organization in a different direction and wanting to kind of put their stamp on an organization. 2, strategic planning. Maybe you've finished a strategic plan, maybe you've lacked one, maybe you're just feeling like in order to move forward, your organization needs a clearer, more compact direction. And then campaign preparation, more internal. Maybe you're good with your organization mission, but you know that you're ready to move into a campaign and you need a philanthropic vision. And then also the new moment we're in today, which right now is, a pandemic. It's cultural uprising, cultural instability, but all of you know that this is not the first time that we have faced different cultural challenges and different moments, whether they're specific to your sector or just general and affecting us all like these moments are. So a vision becomes really critical at these key pivot points. And in those moments, a vision is designed to create a unifying purpose that builds new levels of consensus and buy-in. It's designed to support staff and volunteers by providing an inspirational, overarching message they can easily share. And it's designed to deepen donor and community relationships and help drive transformational giving and commitment. All in all, a vision is the why behind what you do, right? It's designed to really get at the heart of your organization and your work and to unpack and link the day-to-day to the end state you're trying to achieve. I think, Pat, now I'll pass it to you for some principles of visioning that really get into kind of what sets a vision apart rather than what it does.
Yeah. Thanks, Sarah. Yeah, so it's really, again, visioning is something that is really important to consider. It becomes clear and you have a real opportunity to do it at those pivot points. But, it's something that as we've reflected in our visioning work as a firm and Sarah and I as partners doing this stuff together, we've really seen that a couple principles have bubbled up as we reflect on it that really make clear how you need to be thinking about visioning, both in terms of what you write, what a vision looks like, and how you go about the process of building it. So they inform our thinking, shape everything we're going to share in more detail today. We want to just go through them with you at the outset right now. So our first principle is that your vision is more than a plan. It needs to be a rallying cry. Or put differently, your vision is also a message. So like Sarah said, if you want that clear purpose driving all your stakeholders forward, if you want an inspirational message that's going to help staff and volunteers advocate for you more effectively and more confidently, if you want to build deeper relationships and inspire transformational giving, it's not enough to just have strong plans and a set of programs that you're going to be working toward in the future. You need something that really speaks to that why, to the world that you're building that can become a shared rallying cry, giving everything you do deeper meaning. So that's our first principle. It's not just your plan. It needs to be a rallying cry. Second principle is that a vision is something you advance with your community, not something you sell to your community. Now, what we want to acknowledge is that vision is absolutely a creative challenge, but it's not the same as marketing and creative work that you see in the for-profit sector, despite what our board members sometimes think and try to tell us when we begin a visioning process. Ultimately, when you're talking about visioning in the nonprofit world, it's important to keep in mind that you're not trying to sell an idea. You're trying to unearth an idea that probably already exists within your community, but maybe hasn't been stated clearly just yet. The kind of idea that your community can get behind and truly believe in. But because of that, it means you need to bring your community along with you to recognize and elevate the ideas and goals of all your stakeholders. Because ultimately, it's going to be tough to get buy-in for something you dictate to your community. But if you work alongside them, they'll have ownership from the outset and be ready to go out and share your vision. Now, just one important note here that I do want to kind of add here, so a little bit of nuance, is that this principle doesn't mean you can't put ideas out there you've already been thinking about and advance the conversation in a particular direction. But what it does mean is that even if you do that, you need to be really careful to make sure you provide opportunities for genuine input and feedback. In fact, there are some cases where we've been involved And we've seen that the process has kind of ended up about where staff wanted it to and thought it should at the outset. But we're really aware that if we didn't have an inclusive process that gave their community the opportunity to come to that conclusion for themselves and confirm and buy into the direction, it likely would have been so much more contentious and difficult, and it would have been so much less likely that our vision would have been fully embraced. So that's the second principle, that you want to be advancing your vision with your community, not trying just to write it and then sell it to them. And then finally, our third principle is that a strong vision in the nonprofit world will impact everything you do. Think about all the uses it has. It will help your staff and volunteer engagement. It will shape your communications. It will deepen your fundraising, can even give direction and clarity to your planning. And so because of that, we think every organization needs a good vision, and that it's worth dedicating the time, resources, and focus to a good visioning process. This really isn't, in our view, something that's nice to have. It's something that can make any nonprofit stronger and really give direction to you and to your community. Now, just one final note here. I want to just pause to make sure we're clear about our terms. We use vision and visioning, somewhat loosely and expansively, and it can look different in different contexts, right? You can have your long-term organizational vision. The organizational vision, that kind that shows up at one of the first couple pages of your strategic plan or on the About Us of your website. But you can also have shorter-term philanthropic visions, right? Those ones that might be giving your work shape for the next 5 years, or the vision that's guiding your capital campaign that you're going to go to rally transformational support. During our time today, Sarah and I aren't really going to focus too much on that distinction because we really think that the same basic principles are in play in either case. And in fact, we think that once these kind of visioning principles and approaches we're discussing with you now can be used even more broadly. For example, can help you surface and communicate the big idea that might be behind a particular project or a discrete initiative, and can even help you if you're thinking about overall organizational story and brand. The more we've done this, the more we've come to kind of see visioning as a discipline that has broad applicability and whose tenets are worth learning and becoming comfortable with because they'll make you a more effective organization. But ultimately, we do think it's important to think about your organizational vision, your philanthropic vision, and to do this and do it right. So with that, I think we want to just kind of turn back to some of those initial questions. See just if anyone has anything in particular. Again, no pressure here, but we want to see just if there's anything you're hoping to discuss, anything on your mind so that we can make sure we're addressing how you think about vision and what you're hoping to get out of this session.
We currently don't have any suggested topics yet, but we will be holding some time at the end for Q&A, so we hope you send those through throughout the presentation.
Great. All right, well, why don't we just move ahead then and dig into a little bit more deeply, right? So what do those principles mean for how we think about a vision and how we think about visioning? So first, with what makes a vision work, I think it's helpful to kind of begin with examples here. So when we think about the prototypical vision, right, what is the ideal that you might want to strive for? The one that I always turn back to is put a man on the moon, right? That kind of the reason that sometimes you'll hear your moonshot vision that people will talk about. And it's just, think about what makes this work so well. It's vivid, it's clear. You hear this and you know immediately what it means, but just as importantly, you can picture it. You know what success looks like. This vision is about as bold as it can be, but it's also not out of reach. We literally did that, right? So it's achievable, but it's the boldest possible vision that takes many years to work towards and achieve. And it's both a rallying cry, something that's really inspiring and motivating, but also a North Star, right? It gives you purpose and direction, and it can kind of help shape and give a framework to a wide range of other activities it's meant to guide. So that's what we think a great vision looks like. But in the nonprofit sector, we too often see vision statements that look a little more like this. If you don't mind advancing that bit, Molly. You'll see something like, the University of Great Visions will tackle the greatest challenges of the future by building a community in which all who teach, create, and provide care are welcome and respected, where all can pursue and achieve their highest objectives for themselves, their communities, and the world, and where inclusivity and equitability characterize us at every level. Or maybe it looks something like this, if you go to the next slide. At United People of Great Communities, we are working toward a community that is creative, resilient, and economically thriving, with welcome and inclusive neighborhoods characterized by economic opportunity, educational equity, and strong indicators of health and a high quality of life for all residents. Now these, they're a little exaggerated, but based on things we have seen across the sector. And, what I want to be clear about is there's nothing necessarily wrong or bad about this. There's a lot of really good and important stuff in there, and it does reflect a lot of really valid work that's worth pursuing, worth communicating about, and worth seeking funding for. But when you look at a statement like this, the question I always ask is, what's the donor or community member going to take away? Different people are going to hear slightly different things or grasp onto different aspects. It might not be super clear to them. And, on the other side, think about a board member or volunteer. What are they going to remember? What are they actually going to say? How does this help them tell your story, advocate for you, and rally support? So when you look at what the difference is between these vision statements, between put a man on the moon and, these sample, hypothetical, maybe a little bit exaggerated nonprofit vision statements, you really can get a little bit clearer on what the characteristics shape the best kind of vision statements. There are a few things we'd like to point out here. First is that the best vision statements are clear and they're concise. They're also vivid, even visceral, and compelling. You want something that people can picture, that they can feel, that really becomes something in their mind, not a list of kind of, wonky insider nonprofit speak. You want to give them something that really speaks to their aspirations. You also want it to be memorable or even charismatic. This is kind of similar to our communications background, right? When you think about what a sticky message might be, you really want a vision that's going to have something that people can grasp onto. It might be unexpected, it might be a particular word or a particular verb you choose to use. You want it to have something that just really sticks with people so that they remember and come back to it on their own. And finally, you need it to be ambitious, but still credible and specific, or at least specific enough. This is something those of you who have read the management consultant Jim Collins may have heard referred to as your big, hairy, audacious goal. I think that's a really good way to put it. You need that ambition in there to be a truly effective vision. And the good thing is that no matter how complex your plans and vision for the future may be, and those examples we just saw were, pretty complex, they had a lot in them, you can still craft a powerful vision statement no matter what sector you're in within nonprofit world, and no matter what your mission is. So let's look at our examples from before. First, that example with the University of Great Visions that has a lot they want to do about tackling the challenges of our future and the type of community they want to build. Well, really, when you kind of take a step back and think about what are they trying to do, it's about responding to the situation with an innovative spirit, an entrepreneurial spirit, and building the university that the world needs now. So we'll see if our animation can catch up there on the webinar. Thank you, Ali. And then let's go to the other slide too and look at what the united people of great communities are talking about, right? They want a creative, resilient, and thriving community. They want welcoming and inclusive neighborhoods with all these specific indicators, right? Those are all important elements of your plan, how you can measure success, how you can talk about your program. But really what we want people to understand about this is that we're trying to make our city, whichever city this may be, a top 5 place to live and work by 2030, right? You can see the difference between just talking about what you're trying to do and what you're hoping to achieve and actually crafting an effective vision. And if we go to the next slide, what we can see is that when we look across the nonprofit sector, there are powerful visions out there and for a wide range of mission statements. Seeing visions that might say something like, eliminate drug-resistant tuberculosis in the barrios of the world, right? The kind of vision that's super clear, very specific, but let's not miss the point here. This is incredibly bold and difficult to do. That's the kind of thing that you can get behind and work toward for over many, many years. To use a different example that's maybe more abstract than the first one, we've seen people say they want to put the power and wonder of science into everyone's hands. Right now, think about what this does. It's not as specific as eliminate drug-resistant tuberculosis, but it's still providing you with a really vivid image, right? You can picture science. I think it's the in everyone's hands that makes this work. It's an ambitious rallying cry, but also one that can frame more detailed priorities. You can picture how this might set you up to talk about your plans to expand hands-on science education in every high school in the country, or to expand opportunities for young people to participate in science research, for everyone to read about cutting-edge science, or to really expand fairs and science competitions that help young people see a future for themselves in STEM, right? Those are all really important and exciting plans on their own, but what it ultimately you're trying to do for those who believe in the power of science is put the power and wonder of science into everyone's hands. Just a couple other quick examples here. You can imagine for a human service nonprofit talking about their vision to create a community where no child goes hungry. Again, vivid, specific, concise, but man, is that ambitious, and it's also necessary. And finally, you can imagine one that kind of has a vision based more on your internal shifts, where you might say you're trying to build new systems that not only address homelessness, but prevent it, right? It's bold, it's about where you're going as an organization. So with that, let's look at some guidelines, right? What can we take away from these, and what should you keep in mind when trying to craft your vision? First is that in our view, a successful vision is not a plan, and it's not a paragraph. It is, again, a message. You need a vision that can stand on its own and that will really help guide other communications and other conversations. So we always say, come back to this when we're writing it, you want to strive for something that anyone could say off the top of their head, and maybe even alongside your mission statement. Something else I'd say here, this is, maybe comes from my communications background, but I really think the discipline of writing a clear, concise, and compelling message will force you to clarify not just your communications, but your thinking, the substance of your vision. So often we have diffuse vision statements because we don't really know what we're trying to say, or maybe put differently, we know the types of things we're trying to say, but we try to say 3 different things at once, so we get a long paragraph that tries to weave it all together somehow. Crafting a strong vision statement is really going to advance not just how you communicate your vision, but how you think about it. And this way it can really provide a lot of internal guidance, that North Star for your organization. Second thing when you're writing a vision statement, you want to keep in mind that a vision is about clarifying your mission. It's different, right? A vision is what you're doing all the time in the day-to-day. It's what motivates your work. But your vision is what gives it long-term focus and heightened importance by showing what the realization of your mission could look like. So the mission's what you're doing. The vision's what you're working toward. And I think that helps. That's an important distinction to keep in mind, and to also think about why we want our visions to be really vivid or visceral, the kind of thing someone can picture. And finally, the third guideline we like to put out here at the beginning is just to always remember that the purpose of your vision is to engage your community. It's something that you want to have use in the world. You want a vision that draws people in, that invites them to imagine a future they're invested in, and rally support that inspires greater action. And so that leads us right into process. So Sarah, if you like, I'll pass it over to you to kind of talk about what visioning should look like.
Great. Thanks, Pat. I'd love to talk about what the process looks like. And I think this actually ties into one of the questions that we've gotten so far, which is to say, what's the difference between a vision and a mission? Vision, we're telling you that it needs to be a message, not a paragraph, that it needs to be something that unites and rallies your community, that engages your entire community. And you want the same things out of your mission statement, right? And I think oftentimes we're saying all of these things about how you should engage a community, and it sounds big, but how do you get it done? So I want to break that down a little bit. By talking about process, I want to make things a little more tangible. So starting with that question of kind of what the difference between a vision and a mission is, I'll use Campbell and Company as an example. I would say that a mission is kind of what you do day to day to get your vision done. So for Campbell and Company, our vision is to be the partner of choice for nonprofits around the country. That's what we want to be for people. Whether we're there or not, that's something that we're always working towards. It guides our work every day. How we do that, what we do every day to make that a reality, is to collaborate and innovate with people who change lives through philanthropic vision and action. That's our mission, to collaborate with all of you to change lives through philanthropic vision and action. That difference, that kind of what you do in the day-to-day in order to accomplish an end state, is the difference between a mission and a vision. But when you're kind of trying to talk about what the point of a vision is, and why you need it, it can be really challenging because there are all of these things floating around. What's the difference between a mission and a vision? What's the difference between a brand and a mission or a vision. What does that look like and how do you accomplish it? So let's dig in a little bit into an actual visioning process, what it looks like to engage your community, and identify that statement that gives direction to the work that you do every day. So Molly, if you can advance a little bit. Pat and I have developed kind of 4 key questions that help us blend structure to visioning work. So the key to visioning work is that you want to be flexible enough that you can engage an entire community, that you can surface new ideas, but you want to be structured enough that you know what you're doing and what you're going after. So I think here, the key things that we want to talk about are, first, starting out with the fact that visions can occur at different levels, right? So you can have an organizational vision. Pat has talked about this a little bit. You can need to state something for your entire organization that talks about where you're going as an entire group, or you can need a more discrete vision, whether it's for a specific project, a specific philanthropic campaign, or just a new program that you're launching, right? And in this spectrum, there's a spectrum of engagement that you need, no matter where you fall, right? So if you're looking for a big organizational vision, you're going to need to engage a different group of people, and probably a much larger group of people than if you're looking for a specific project-oriented vision or campaign vision, where the audience that you need to talk to, the people that you need to surface ideas from and bring along and create consensus in, is much smaller. So at the start of any visioning process, it's key to just take time and be clear about the statement that you're looking for, the direction that you're looking to articulate, and how you expect it to impact your organization. Do you expect it to be something every single person in your community can latch onto, or is this something specifically for your donor community? Is it specific to a department or a team? Who do you need to bring along? Who do you need to unite and bring together? Whatever the context here, wherever you fall in that spectrum, it's just really key to be clear about its scope and purpose, because that helps you determine who should be involved, how broad that involvement should be, and how extensive a process is required. There are times when we engage in visioning processes, just to loop back around to that vision-mission difference. There are times when we engage in the vision process and we realize we also need to articulate a better mission statement. As we get to that kind of visionary ideal, that end state, we realize that we need to be clearer about the how as well, or just need to adjust how an organization is talking about it. But it's helpful to kind of look at things and analyze what you're really after before you walk into a visioning process. Once you've kind of clarified that, you just want to recognize that visioning is a community process. Pat talked about how it's not something, a vision statement isn't something you want to sell to your community. It's not something you want to create internally and then try and convince everyone to love. It's something you want to find in your community, create with your community, and bring your community forward with. So visioning is a community process, but it needs a really strong editor. Pat talks about getting to that tight, concise, charismatic statement, and I will tell you, I have 7 communications colleagues, Pat and I do. I would partner with any of them any day. They are all incredibly talented. But if you put all of us in a room and asked us to get to one sentence that we all liked, that we thought did what it needed to do, I think it would take us 6 months and like 5 therapists. So you really need to zero in on who's leading the process, who's going to be in charge of synthesizing and elevating concepts, and then ultimately who's going to do the writing. So Molly, if you'll advance a little, the next question that we want to deal with and the tactics that we want to talk about are just fundamentally who's going to lead the process and what are the tactics they're going to use. So this starts with assigning a single person or a small group to own visioning results and really drive the process. So this is to say, like, maybe if you're working on a really concise philanthropic vision or a project-oriented vision, this is just one person who knows the work really well. Maybe if you're working on a bigger campaign or you're working organizational-wide, organizationally wide, this is 2 to 3 people. But you want enough brain power in the room that you can elevate new ideas and maybe bounce off of one another, but you don't want so much brain power in the room that you're paralyzed or that you're overwhelmed. So a small core group is ideal for conducting interviews, leading workshops, crafting initial ideas, and revising based on community input. Hopefully having that core group will help you pick up momentum and have a clearer, stronger output than you might if you didn't have someone or that small group owning the process. The key here is that you want to use committees, but you don't want to write by committee. So having too many people in the room is a surefire way to come up with kind of a Franken concept that isn't as sharp as it could be, maybe has been way overworked, or to enter paralysis by analysis. So you really just want to focus on who's going to actually do the writing and how you're going to include larger groups of people to guide decision making. So that leads us to talking about, you've got your core leadership group. You don't want to fall into writing in committee, but you do want to make sure that you have community representation. And how do you do that? And how do you make sure that your community is involved in any decisions you're making about which direction you might go with this vision? So what we advocate for is either taking a board task force that already exists and modifying it, focusing it on visioning, or creating an ad hoc visioning task force, usually of, maybe 4 to 6 people. If it's a bigger organization, it can get bigger. But have that group be the group that you're going to use to help sift through ideas. So as the core leadership group or the core leadership individual finishes discovery, they've talked to people, they've interviewed people, they have ideas, they've come up with concepts, you want to have a committee that you can go to and say, here are the 3 to 5 concepts that are most interesting. Which ones do you like best? Which ones do you think we should bring to the wider community? That core leadership group will help you sift through those, make decisions about what you should take forward, and then as you take things forward and as you continue refining, they'll be the group that's in charge of, helping you decide ultimately which concept you go forward with, which one you refine, and as you get down into the statement itself and getting to that short, charismatic articulation, they'll be the ones to hopefully finalize it, approve it, and be the first people to advocate for it in your community. Now, the key thing here and the point of this group is to make sure that the full breadth of your community has some sort of representation in the decision-making process and at the decision-making table. So while, co-opting a board group or bringing board members in can be really helpful, when it's just board members, you run the risk of coming up with something that makes a lot of sense to kind of leadership level people who are very close to the organization, but may not make as much sense to people on the ground. So when you create these task forces or this committee, you want to make sure that it's inclusive. It may need, volunteers. It may need constituents or students that aren't at that leadership level. But you just really want to make sure that you have as full of a representation of your community as you can in the room, and tie that back to the ultimate impact you're hoping to have with this vision statement. All right, Molly, let's keep going. The next thing, so we talked a little bit about the structure, having a leadership group or a leadership person and having this committee that's going to partner with them to go back and forth a little bit, lend guidance and focus. The big thing here, and the reason those two things are necessary, is because a visioning process is a feedback-driven process. It's really, really about engaging your community and putting them front and center. It's really easy to drown in feedback. It's really easy to not know what feedback you really need. It's hard to prioritize feedback. It's hard to control feedback once you've invited it. And I think that a strong visioning process relies on really robust feedback, because more feedback now means stronger buy-in and enthusiasm later. So as we've worked through different visioning processes with different sized organizations, we've come up with a few kind of principles that we live by. It'll look different for every process and every community, but there are a couple things that we try and stick to that really help us set expectations for feedback, get the input that we really need, and work through it in a way that helps us prioritize and really move forward without kind of getting lost in analysis. So moving forward, the third question that we would elevate is just straight up, how will we solicit input and feedback? So that starts with being clear about the input and feedback you need. So this is, again, tying back to the first question, which is all about context and really what you want your vision statement to do. Once you've decided that you need a vision, either at an organizational level or at a smaller level, a more focused level, you know, generally speaking, who in your community is closest to that work. You know who knows the most. You also know who you want to bring in and who you want to have the most buy-in. So when you're thinking about feedback and gathering feedback in a visioning process, you really want to be proactive. You want to know who you want to get to the table. So that means being strategic and inclusive. You want to be able to engage as many people as you think you need to engage to be successful, but that doesn't mean that everyone needs to be engaged through a one-on-one interview, right? So you really want to think specifically about how best and how deeply to involve specific stakeholder groups, and then be intentional about making those stakeholders feel represented through means that match the feedback that you need from them. So when you're thinking about elevating feedback through your community, don't stick to one tactic or one process. Really draw on multiple tactics if you can. This means, like, when you're looking for broad-based input, when you want to know, generally speaking, what your community is thinking, that's when you might look at broad-based surveys that give you that snapshot of your wider community. When you want the detail level stuff, the stuff that, you know, your internal staff knows or your closest donors are going to be most impactful for, then turn to one-on-one interviews. Think about collaborative workshops that will help you elevate ideas with small groups who know your work relatively well, and then think about small groups and focus groups of your wider community where you can take those ideas that you've just elevated and test them. When you're thinking about including people in a visioning process, there are a lot of different touch points that you can have and a lot of different ways to invite people in at different levels and hopefully kind of inspire the feedback you need at the point that you need it at. That can look 100 different ways. Pat and I have started with one-on-one interviews, moved into a survey, and then gone into focus groups. We've started with workshops, then moved into one-on-one interviews, then done a survey. It can go in a lot of different directions, but whatever you decide is the most effective, whatever you decide is going to be the best for including the most people most substantively, really outline that process from the outside, share it as transparently as you can, show people the timeline, show people your goals and who you're engaging when and why and what they're going to see, and then try and stick to that process. There's no doubt that as you wade into it, opinionated, passionate people are going to get really pumped about what you're doing, either in a good way or a bad way, and they're going to start sharing feedback that you may or may not find productive. But so long as you can call back to a process that you've outlined from the get-go and talk about, what stage you're at this point, what kinds of feedback you're looking for at this particular point with this kind of engagement, whether it's a workshop, an interview, or a survey, you have more ground to stand on in terms of sifting through that feedback. Finally, we'll move to our fourth question, which starts with this principle. As you're thinking about, Molly, can you go back one? Maybe not. Oh, there you go. Thank you. So I think as you're thinking about all the different ways that you can engage people, all the different process that you could design and structure, the big key here is that in a community review process, in a community-oriented process, every point of engagement is really an opportunity to bring people along. Visioning isn't just about listening to your community and elevating that feedback and sifting through it. It's really about people in your community having an opportunity to hear one another as well, having an opportunity to listen to one another, let one another change their opinions, persuade them, and start to align along collective ideas that drive their passion and motivation. When you think about a community review process and engaging your community this way, it doesn't mean that everything you put in front of your community needs to be perfectly designed, something you're totally sold on. Sometimes a bad idea, a bad vision statement is exactly what your community needs to see in order to align around the vision statement that's right for them, the concept that's right for them, and move forward and get to the right idea. So thinking about that, our fourth question here is, how will we draft and refine? So once you've got that engagement process nailed down, you have your leadership person or your small group that's driving everything, and you have that committee that's ready to help sift through things, how do you start actually writing things and presenting concepts? So this means starting with simple concepts for people to respond to instead of perfectly crafted statements. Avoid wordsmithing until you have more clarity about really what you're trying to capture and which direction you want to go, until you've confirmed that general direction. People will get bogged down in what words they like and don't like, and there is a time for that for sure, but getting bogged down there and too early in the process can close off really great directions or ideas that people are reacting to, not because they don't like the actual direction, but because they don't like the way it's captured. So think about capturing concepts rather than perfect statements. And as you think about those concepts, make sure that they explore different possibilities, different directions. This can feel kind of artificial. Pat and I will sit in rooms and we'll be like, it really is this one way. You can only write it the one way. And we'll argue with one another until we artificially find 2 or 3 other ways, whether that's thinking about framing it as community-centric, organizationally centric, whether we're thinking about legacy versus future-facing. There are all kinds of ways that you can think about framing similar ideas and similar concepts that will really help kind of tease out what's most important to lead with in a vision statement. Don't self-edit too early. Sometimes an idea that you think is a little off the wall is actually the idea your community is going to latch onto and run with. So really use these concepts to explore different directions, even if one of them is for sure going to end up closed down really quickly once people see it. Finally, this is when you're going to use that ad hoc task force or board and committee to really synthesize community feedback and engagement. So you'll start simple with these concepts. Your board, your committee will help you decide which concepts with refinement should go to a wider community, whether that's through leadership briefings or focus groups or through a wider survey. But they'll help you elevate those initial ideas and then bring back the feedback to that group. Tell them what you're hearing. Tell them what you're experiencing. Tell them what you seem to be seeing in the room. And they'll help you decide which concept to move forward with, which one to start narrowing down on, and how to really focus it and what's most important. So it's hard to make those decisions when you're drowning in feedback if you're on your own. You've heard anything and everything. You've heard every idea. You've tried writing every concept. You need that objective third party, that other group representing your community to help you sift through that idea and refine it.
And
all right.
Can I just jump in real quick to underscore something you said as well? I think especially at that point where sometimes we will get together, the first thing we write, we feel like that's it. We nailed it. We're so excited about it, but we really have to almost artificially force ourselves to go through the discipline of approaching it from different angles, finding different expressions, different ideas, different directions to pursue. And I think oftentimes, I'll admit sometimes with that first expression, I'll almost want to get locked in. I'll get so excited, be like, all right, that's it. We nailed it. And it's like, do we have to go through the the exercise of preparing others. But I think what's great is if you really sit down and force yourself to do it in good faith and to really ask yourself, what's a different angle that I'm thinking about here? You'll tend to get other ideas that are equally as strong that you can push towards. Usually I'll kind of get really excited about the first one, then frustrated that I have to create more. And then I get more excited about the second one. And then maybe by the end, I like the third one best. And I think it's helpful, but that's also why it's so important to begin with the simple concepts, ideally the one sentence vision statement, because that forces you to get some differentiation and really clarify that it's not just different ways of saying the same thing. It's about really deciding on a clear direction you want to pursue.
And I'd also just add that that's one of the reasons having 1 to 3 people be that core group that's driving ideas is so key. It's really easy to get fixated on the way you think things should go, especially if you've gotten in the weeds on something. And it's helpful to have someone who has a different perspective, pushing you to think differently and really dig in and explore that.
Great. So we do have several audience questions. The first question being, beyond a broad organizational mission, how do we elevate the vision of our projects? For example, in the conservation world, our science staff is often afraid of making bold statements about what we can accomplish. Where is the middle ground between inspiring and accomplishable?
Start taking a stab at that one if you want, Sarah. And
Sure.
then maybe you want to jump in, just add anything to it. I think, it is funny. I think the conservation world is one we're very familiar with. And as a communications person who's done a lot of work in it, I find that our science staff is both the best and at times the most frustrating because they think like scientists, they give great information, they're so smart, but it's not always helpful for your communications because they want to write like a scientist too. I think that there are a couple things I would do here to try and get them on board, because the thing is, it does come, it's a credible point to make, right? It's an important point. You want your vision to be ambitious, to be inspiring and motivating, but it does have to be something you can actually accomplish, or you'll lose credibility with your stakeholders. First thing I would do is try to make sure to reframe it just a little bit. Think about what you're trying to do and who it's for. So, maybe your science staff, your conservation staff, they want to say, we're going to increase wetlands for migratory birds by 30%, right? But ask them, when you're talking to someone who's not already in the conservation world, why does that matter to them? What do you say to them that's really going to get them engaged? If that's the first thing you say, and they're like, oh, cool, what's that mean? You want to have that's the answer you need. Because really, again, like we said earlier, this is where you get to visioning being more than a plan or paragraph, but a message, a rallying cry. You need that message, not just that plan for what you're going to do, because it's ultimately going to be something that's, in addition to guiding your work, something you communicate. The other thing is I would make sure to differentiate between outcomes or metrics and a vision. So I think, you can have the exact same credible outcomes. It could be increased by 30%, but that doesn't mean those outcomes are your vision. They're how you measure your progress towards your vision. But your vision is going to be something bigger that might be expressed a little differently. And finally, I would think about kind of the difference between those two examples that we shared that I went through earlier, right? One is eliminate drug-resistant tuberculosis in the barrios of the world. Now, that's the kind that your science staff might be thinking about, but maybe you're going to something that's more like put the power and wonder of science into everyone's hands. And the most literal level, first of all, it doesn't have literal meaning. It only has kind of metaphorical meaning, but it will not literally be in every single person's hands. It's almost, to use science-friendly words, an asymptotic vision. And that's okay too. It's something that does accurately reflect what you're trying to do and achieve, that can be inspiring, but that your specific programs with really concrete, tangible measurables and outcomes and metrics associated with them can still fit underneath. So I think bringing in that message or communications lens, thinking about audience, and differentiating between outcomes and a vision are really important to help get them on board, as well as making sure you have other stakeholders in the room too.
Great.
Sarah, would you add anything to that very rambly response?
No, I thought that was a great response, and you touched on a lot of the things I was thinking about or I think about this question, I think the big thing there is just really digging in on community and audience. Your vision has to work for more than your science staff, and obviously you know that, and sometimes they need that reminder. But I think outcomes look different for your science staff than for your community a lot of the time. With conservation work, with even education work, sometimes talking about a vision actually becomes about talking about a state for your community to be in, rather than we're going to conserve, X number of acres or, save Y species, etc. It becomes really about creating an organization and a community that's always engaged in this work, always adapting to it, and kind of thinking about that. So that's just kind of doubling down on Pat's invocation of audience, and then his distinction between kind of outcomes and that, visionary end state.
Great, thanks so much. Our next question is, can you share an example of when you've been a part of a process where the organization has received feedback that they didn't expect? Did they pivot, and what did they do with that feedback?
Sure. I'm sure, Pat, you have a ton of examples of this. I have one in mind, so I'm happy to kind of take the first stab at this one. I think, the time that I'm thinking of when an organization got unexpected feedback, it wasn't necessarily that the feedback itself, like the content of it, was specific or shocking. It's that it came so late in the game, right? So they've done all their engaging. They've started narrowing things down. They've got 3 or 4 concepts that they've elevated to the community. And up to this point, those 3 or 4 concepts have been going really well. People are responding well. They're thinking about them. And then you get someone in the room who just throws in a totally other approach and starts trying to convince everyone else in the room that that's the approach that should be taken. And I think in moments like that, what's challenging is you've created this visioning process to engage the full breadth of your community, but in that moment you're getting very specific feedback that only a tiny part of it is hearing and responding to. And so I would say in that moment, the organization did not pivot. The organization, took that feedback as, kind of out of the blue feedback that was coming from a very specific place with very specific context, and started dealing with it. And they had to do a lot to work through that with their community. But they stood on the fact that that idea really hadn't been elevated from the full breadth of their community and didn't represent the full extent of the process that they had been undertaking. I think that if that idea and that feedback, while it was unexpected, it was an unexpected direction for the organization, if that had been elevated early in the process, if it had been surprising earlier in the process, I think the organization would have pivoted and would have thought about that a little differently. I think we would have advised that we continue to kind of bring that concept forward. So I think for me, a lot of the time, feedback, how you respond to it, depends less on context and more on when it's happening, where it's coming from, and how much of your community it really represents and will ring true for. Pat, I'll pass it to you.
Yeah, that's great, sir. I think that's a good specific example. I think rather than sharing an example, I kind of wanted to step back and talk in general about how to deal with feedback, because especially with an inclusive process that touches a number of different people and brings different people in, you probably should expect at least some feedback that you didn't anticipate and view it as a good thing. I think the general principle for me is we're not selling this to a community, right? We're trying to bring them along with us, and we genuinely need to be open to feedback, even if it changes your direction. So I think you need to make sure you honor all feedback you receive, but you also need to make sure you interpret it. Who is it coming from? What's motivating it? Do we take it at face value, or do we just kind of keep it in the back of our minds and refining because it's actually them reacting to something different and expressing it in terms of, trying to push our direction in a different way? I do think you should always be ready to pivot. This goes along with where Sarah was saying, don't self-edit too much, put a few different ideas and directions out. That's inviting people to really respond and tell you, you might hear those 3 directions are all wrong, but what about this 4th one? And you might need to consider adjusting or extending your process if you do get unexpected feedback that suggests a direction you hadn't considered, but that does seem to be one your community wants, I think if you need to, revise what you already have, if you want to go out and have another conversation, another focus group, that's not something I would just throw out off the bat. I wouldn't rule it out. I think it's a possibility. But if you've designed your process well, most feedback you receive, even though expressed unexpectedly, should be things that generally reflect what you've already heard because you've been engaging your community along the way. So I think that minimizes the risk of needing to make a last minute pivot. So again, it's honor it, but interpret it and try and understand it and figure out how you can best incorporate it if it's something that's shared beyond the particular source it's coming from.
Great, thank you. I think we have time for one last question. The question is, when you're developing a vision statement and bringing it to your community, how do you know if your vision is working or still needs more work?
Do you want me to start this one, Sarah, or do you want to begin? Oh, you're on mute, but I think you're saying, if I'm reading your lips right, you're telling me to go ahead.
Yeah, hit it. Sorry.
Yeah, so I think the one thing to keep in mind here is when you ask for feedback, you are going to get feedback. And that doesn't mean and if feedback is critical or constructively critical, that doesn't necessarily mean that you're going in the wrong direction, right? You're going to get feedback and you need to figure out what to do with it or how to interpret it. I think generally speaking, what I do, I think this is where first having multiple options helps, because if you only put one thing in front of someone, they're going to try and push on what's wrong when you ask for feedback, because you're almost prompting it. But if you put three out there, usually they can see what's wrong about one or two of them, and that helps them see what's right about the third option that they really like. I think the other thing, though, is once you begin to narrow down with just one, and you're trying to get feedback, it helps to not only just try and get a read on their excitement, right, on what people are gravitating towards, but to ask the kind of questions that aren't saying, is this good or bad? Is this working or not? But, what does this mean to you? How would you express what this looks like in practice? Could you see yourself saying this to someone else? And when you start trying to ask them to internalize it and see how they respond, you can usually see if it's working for them or not, because it's something that people can riff on, that they do kind of get excited about, that does give them ideas. It usually means you're going in the right direction. But if they're asking you questions, if they're uncertain or hesitant, if they're kind of holding back and saying, yeah, they're all three of those options are fine, but they don't really speak to me, that means you're probably not yet having the kind of thing that's going to rally your community, going to speak to your stakeholders, and you have work to do and might want to, in the next round, really look at how you hear the feedback to either synthesize something from what you have or develop a new direction entirely.
Yeah, I think that's making sure I'm not on mute. I think that's great, Pat. And I think the simple test that I would add within that kind of full narrative is that when it's working, people start using it. They don't, like all these, moments of giving feedback, when you put three options in front of someone, like Pat said, if everyone sits back and is like, well, generally I like number two instead of number one, number three, but, and then the room goes silent, you're just not in a place where it's working yet. So when something's working, immediately gets adopted, people start talking about it. They might still have things that they want to address, they want to correct, they want to refine, but they start trying to convince their peers that it's good. They start talking about why it's good and why it's working for them. And that starts to happen naturally. So there are a couple reasons that people might not pick up on a vision concept or a vision statement. Some of that is just like they're not feeling it. The right concept hasn't been elevated yet. Sometimes it's the way it's written. It's not memorable enough. It's not clicking. It's hard to say. But I really just think, like, fundamentally, it's working when people start using it, even before you've decided that's the statement or the concept you're going to go with.
Yeah, that's a great point to make, Sarah. And I think, it's when people kind of hang back, it feels like you're talking at them, and that means that your vision's kind of talking at them. Again, you're not trying to sell them on something and dictate to them what to believe, right? But if they're saying it in their own words, then it's something that's speaking to them. They can really tell by that.
Great. Well, big thanks to Sarah and Pat for sharing your wisdom with us today. And with that, we'd like to thank you all for joining us. Within 24 hours, you'll be receiving a follow-up email from GoToWebinar with a link to the recording and the slides. In the meantime, please don't hesitate to email our presenters with any questions you have. Thanks so much and have a great day.